Hello, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Today we're going to look at Shachah. The Hebrew word Shachah occurs 172 times in the Old Testament. Reverend Strong allocated it the number 7,812 in his concordance. Shachah is a verb, and its literal meaning is to bow down, either in respect or submission to another person, in worship to the true God, or in worship to a false god. It's the primary Hebrew word for worship. In fact, as part of this research, I visited an atypically brusque Jewish website where, admittedly in not so many words, it said, "Shachah is worship, worship is Shachah, that's all there is to it, go away, stop asking questions." Well, here it is in Hebrew. The first letter is Shin, which in this case is a sh sound. If the dot had been over the left prong, it would be a s sound. Underneath it is the kamesh vowel, a. The next letter is chet, which is a ch sound, as in Bach. People who aren't used to these guttural sounds, like me, tend to pronounce it as a k sound. Apologies to Hebrew scholars if I do this in the video. Anyway, there's another kamesh vowel, and the last letter is he, an h, shachah. Shachah is arguably the closest Hebrew word in meaning to the English word worship. Worthship, says, "I ascribe worth to you," while Shachah, by implication, says, "You are higher, better, greater, stronger than I am, so I bow down before you." As we said, it's an act of respect and submission. Now, if you look up the page on Bible Hub for Shachah, you'll see it defined as to bow down, to bow in worship, to prostrate yourself, or to worship. It's worth pointing out now that Shachah is one of several of these Hebrew worship words that have an implicit physical action. In the second video we saw that halal meant go a bit crazy, but it doesn't really specify how. With Shachah it's a definite movement, a posture to adopt, of bowing down. Not just kneeling, in fact there's a different worship word for kneeling, which we'll look at that later, but putting your face to the ground. As he said, Shachah is found 172 times in the Old Testament, and in one of three contexts, depending on who it is you're bowing down to. The first is what we could call the social Shachah, where it talks about Shachahing to another person. In these cases, the English word is always to bow, bow down, prostrate yourself, something like that. The second is the God context, where someone is Shachahing to God. These cases are mostly translated as worship, but by no means always. The third context is idolatry, where someone is shachahing an idol, or the sun, the moon, the stars, any other false god. Again, these are generally translated as worship, again, not always. If you count up the totals for each context, you'll find they're not that far apart. There are 59 social shachahs, 60 god shachahs, and 55 idolatrous shachahs. And if you're any good at mental arithmetic, you may be wondering how those three numbers can add up to 172, and the answer is they don't. In two of the verses, the context is a bit ambiguous, so I've counted them as both social and God shachahs, and we'll look at them in a minute. But why shouldn't they be ambiguous? It's the same Hebrew word. The distinction only comes when you try and translate it into English. The first time we see Shachah in the Old Testament is in Genesis chapter 18, when Abraham has some unexpected visitors. And what do you think? Is this a social Shachah or a God Shachah? Now in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 2 we read, "Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried to the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground." So far so polite, and every English translation I found renders Shachah as bowing low, or some variation, bowing to the earth, bowing low to the ground, etc. The word worship is never used for this verse, and we're left with the question, who are these three strangers? Well, the narrator is sure, because in verse 1 it says, "The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day." And in the very next verse these three strangers appear. Well, you know the story. Abraham offers them food, which they accept. Then they tell Abraham his wife Sarah is going to have a baby, which she overhears, and it makes her laugh because she thinks she's past all that. They ask why she's laughing. She says, "I didn't laugh." It all gets a bit awkward. Well, we just don't know whether Abraham realised this was a visitation by God himself. And perhaps that's why the translators don't use worship but bow down. But it's the same word, Shachah. Now, two of the strangers go on from Abraham's place down to Sodom, and this is where we find the second ambiguous Shachah. Genesis chapter 19 verse 1 says, "The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground." Again, it's God or his angels, and not Shachahs when he sees them coming. And as with Abraham's encounter, every English translation renders it bow down. Now, back to Abraham and the first time Shachah is translated as worship. 4 chapters on from where the visitors arrive at Abraham's tent, their word has come true. Laughing boy Isaac has been born and starts to grow up, and God tests Abraham by telling him to sacrifice him. And it's in this context, the context of human sacrifice, that we see Shachah used next. Now in Genesis 22 we read how Abraham sets off with Isaac and some of his servants and a donkey to carry all the stuff needed for the sacrifice. They get to the place, and he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." That's Genesis chapter 22 verse 5. Now this time Shachah is translated as worship. In fact, it's the first time in any English translation of the Bible that we see the word worship. So in chapter 18, when the 3 strangers visit Abraham, Shachah is translated bow down. And again when 2 of the 3 come to Lot in Sodom. Now in Genesis 22, when Abraham's going to sacrifice Isaac, Shachah is translated as worship. And that's consistent in all English translations. Now, on to Exodus and some unambiguous worship. In chapter 33 we read of the tent of meeting, where Moses would go to talk to God. Verses 9 and 10 go, "As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses." That's Exodus 33 verse 9. "Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance to the tent, they all stood and worshipped, each at the entrance of their tent." And that's verse 10. Now the Hebrew words here are kum, which is translated stand or arise, and shachah, translated worship, bow down, prostrate themselves. This is a tricky one to translate because kum means to stand up, and straight after they shachah, which means to get face down on the floor, or at least bow down. I think what's happening here is everyone starts by sitting on the ground at the door of their tent, just like Abraham was when the 3 strangers arrived. Then, oh look, there goes Moses off to the tent of meeting, show some respect, up we get. Then when he goes inside the tent and the cloud comes down, whoa, get down and shachah. That seems to be the consensus in most of the translations, though it's also possible that you might be able to shachah from a standing position. Who knows? Shachah occurs 17 times in the Psalms, and you won't be surprised to hear that most of them are about shachahing God. Now here are a few of them from the Psalms. Some are translated worship, some are translated bow down. Here's the first from Psalm 5 verse 7. "But I, by your great love, can come into your house. In reverence I bow down toward your holy temple." And that bow down, shachah. There's another one from Psalm 29. "Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendour of his holiness." And that worship is shachah. That's Psalm 29 verse 2. And how about Psalm 66 verse 4? "All the earth bows down to you. They sing praise to you. They sing the praises of your name." That's Psalm 66 verse 4. And that bow down, shachah. And Psalm 72 verse 11. "May all kings bow down to him and all nations serve him." That's Psalm 72 verse 11. And that bow down, shachah. "All the nations you have made will come and worship before you, Lord. They will bring glory to your name." That's Psalm 86 verse 9. And worship there is shachah. "O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker." That's Psalm 95 verse 6. There's some extra bowing down here actually. The worship is shachah, but that bow down is a different Hebrew word, kara. This also means to bow down, or to crouch, or to get down a drink from a stream. It's even used when someone's mortally wounded and slumps to the ground. But kara is not done in relation to another person, and it's never translated as worship. So Shachah is more than just bowing down, it's bowing down in relation to another, in this case to God. Okay, on to Psalm 96 verse 9. Worship the Lord in the splendour of his holiness, tremble before him all the earth. And again, worship is Shachah. Now we've got two verses from Psalm 99. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool, he is holy. That's verse 5. Then, and worship is Shachah. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy mountain, for the Lord our God is holy. Again, both these cases, worship is from Shachah. And in both these verses, the psalmist starts by saying, exalt the Lord our God, that is, lift him high, before going on to Shachah at his footsteps or his holy mountain. That is, get yourself down before him. And this takes us back to the idea in Psalm 96 of bowing down in relation to God. Also the idea of worship being ascribing worth. Now in most or all of these examples, Shachah could be translated either way, as worship or bow down. And both work in English, and of course it's the same word in Hebrew. We're the ones drawing a distinction between the two by having to shoehorn it into one English word or another. As we saw from the beginning, Shachah is one of several praise and worship words that have an implicit physical action, in this case bowing down or even lying flat on your face. Unlike kara though, which can mean collapsing and dying, Shachah always seems to be something you do in relation to someone or something else, and something you do on purpose, making a controlled descent if you like. And yet Shachah is also the nearest the Hebrew gets to our English word worship, to the songs we sing in church, to our pouring out our hearts in adoration to God. In Hebrew, Shachah always seems to imply a physical action, lying prostrate on the floor. This isn't unknown today, but it's certainly not something everyone does in every church service. One more thing before we come into land. In the last video we looked at Joshua's speech to the Israelites before they entered the Promised Land, concluding with that stirring, "As for me and my house we will obey the Lord." And of course the Israelites all said yes to that. "Rah, rah, rah, we're with you, Joshua." Well, that lasted until Judges chapter 2. First Joshua died, then everyone who remembered him died, and in verses 11 and 12 we read, "Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger." That's Judges 2 verses 11 and 12. Now the word here translated worship is shachah, while the word translated as served is abad, that we looked at last time. Now in the last video we looked at the words abad and aboda, translated here as serve, but also as work or worship. I mentioned that they often paired with shachah, and this is one of those times. There are actually 29 verses in the Old Testament where that happens. Worship and serve and worship, of course, both are part of our faith. We are to shachah, worship, and abad, serve God. Worship without service is dead religion. Service without worship is just doing stuff out of habit, or even in the hope it'll make God like you. Sadly though, this pairing of shachah and abad, and in the other verses where these two words are found together, it's never about God. It's always either warning the Israelites not to go after foreign gods, or else just reporting they did just that. Well, where does that start? Let's go back to Exodus in chapter 20 and the 10 Commandments. Commandment number 2 is no idol worship, and verses 4 and 5 go, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven or above, on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." And here that bow down is shachah and worship is abad. There's another pairing in Exodus 23 where God tells the Israelites to break down the idols and the pagan altars they find in the Promised Land. "Do not bow down before their gods or worship them or follow their practices. You must demolish them and break their sacred stones to pieces." That's Exodus 23 verse 24. Onward in Deuteronomy there are 8 pairings of shachah and abad, all relating to foreign gods. There are 2 in Joshua, 3 in Judges, we looked at one a minute ago, 4 each in 1st and 2nd Kings, 3 in 2nd Chronicles, 5 in Jeremiah. A few are telling the people not to worship foreign gods, but most are just saying they did. A few years ago I read a piece in the news about some archaeological excavation of ancient Israelite settlements in the Holy Land, and it revealed that the people back then were worshipping idols. The piece went on to say that this proves the Bible isn't true. Well, of course you'll always get readers if you say the Bible's not true, but honestly, whoever wrote that never read the Old Testament. Of course they worshipped idols. The Bible says they did, even though they were told again and again not to. You might say the Israelites had an idolatry problem throughout their history, and we can have the problem too, which is why the Apostle John finishes his first letter with these words: "Dear children, keep yourself free from idols." The fact that Shachah, bow down, and abad and aboda, work and service, are both translated as worship in English at different places, causes all sorts of confusion and arguments. Is singing to God worship? Yes, it's Shachah. Is serving coffee, setting out the chairs, and generally serving worship? Yes, it's aboda. Both are worship. Are they the same thing? No, of course not. They're two different Hebrew words meaning two different things. But we have so many arguments because of our lack of vocabulary. Shachah means bowing down. Now in my church we either sit or stand. In other churches they have hassocks to kneel on. Should we think about other postures of worship though? Kneeling, bowing, prostrating ourselves. After all, if aboda involves our whole life, shouldn't Shachah involve our whole body? Now to sum up, Shachah is about humility before God, submission to God, a physical response to God. It puts your head below your heart. That's an interesting thought. Oh, and if you get down on the ground, it puts you back in touch with the dust from which you were formed. If you remember how Ha-Adam came from the dust of Ha-Adamah. And remember Judges 2 and all those pairings of Shachah and aboda. Shachah worship can be rightly or wrongly directed. And is there anything in your life that is in danger of taking God's place? As Bob Dylan put it, you're going to have to serve someone, or abad, or Shachah. And as John said, dear children, keep yourselves from idols. That's all for Shachah. Next time we'll look at another word that involves a physical action, yada.